Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. Well, my goodness, it's been an eventful week and a half or so. Uh, we had people rioting at the Capitol when the Congress was meeting to certify Joe Biden's election. And then Donald Trump was subsequently kicked off of Twitter. His account was permanently suspended, apparently, by Twitter. He was banned from several other social media sites, at least for the time being. And then, I guess you've heard, he was impeached for a second time, setting a record, the only president in U.S. history to have been impeached twice. So, I want to talk about those events and what to make of them. So, without further ado, in thinking about the storming of the Capitol, one very curious thing has to be noted. This summer, we had the largest protests in U.S. history. Black Lives Matter protests sparked primarily by the murder of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis, and secondarily by some of the other murders of black people by police and other aspects of repression against people of color in this country. Largest protests in U.S. history. Despite that, and despite some looting that took place and a fair bit of property destruction in some protests, but not others, there was no plan or effort to take over the Capitol building or any other federal building in Washington, D.C. And yet, we had this massive police presence. So, and in contrast to that, there was a fairly minimal police presence at the Capitol when these hundreds of people, backed by tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people protesting outside, but hundreds of people who supported Donald Trump and thought that the election had been stolen from him, and some of whom at least wanted to overturn the results of the election, wanted to actually try to stop the certification of Biden's election, were somehow able to get into the Capitol building. So as Nico says, damn, so you're telling me I can actually storm the Capitol building if I'm a white dude with a Confederate flag, but I can't peacefully protest without being shot with tear gas and having the shit beat out of me if I'm black or advocate for black causes. Only in motherfucking America. And, he's got a point there. There seems to be this obvious double standard. And it's not as though these protests were not known about in advance. As this article on PBS's website points out, the Capitol rioters planned for weeks in plain sight. They did a lot of the planning on Facebook and a lot of outlets that law enforcement had ready access to. So as they say, Capitol rioters planned for weeks in plain sight. The police weren't ready. And they go on to say the invasion of the U.S. Capitol on Wednesday was stoked in plain sight. For weeks, the far-right supporters of President Donald Trump railed on social media that the election had been stolen. They openly discussed the idea of violent protest on the day Congress met to certify the result. We came up with the idea to occupy just outside the Capitol on January 6th, meaning that's the date when they intended to do that. Leaders of the Stop the Steal movement wrote on December 23rd. They called their Wednesday demonstration the Wild Protest, a name taken from a tweet by Trump that encouraged his supporters to take their grievances to the streets of Washington. "We'll be wild," the president tweeted. Ali Alexander, the founder of the movement, encouraged people to bring tents and sleeping bags and avoid wearing masks for the event. Typical Trump supporter move, not wearing a mask, either for not just for concealment of identity purposes, obviously, but because we have a pandemic, it might have been a good idea if they did. "If DC escalates, so do we," Alexander wrote on Parler last week, one of scores of social media posts welcoming violence that were reviewed by ProPublica. I'm not sure who that is, in the weeks leading up to Wednesday's attack on the Capitol. But for reasons that remained unclear Wednesday night, the law enforcement authorities charged with protecting the nation's entire legislative branch, nearly all of the 535 members of Congress, gathered in a joint session along with Vice President Mike Pence, who was also present, were ill-prepared to contain the forces massed against them. On Wednesday afternoon, a thin line of U.S. Capitol Police with only a few riot shields between them and a knot of angry protesters engaged in hand-to-hand combat with rioters on the steps of the west side of the Capitol building. Videos showed officers stepping aside and sometimes taking selfies with the protesters, as if to usher Trump supporters into the building they were supposed to guard. A former Capitol policeman, well-versed in his agency's procedures, was mystified by the scene he watched unfold on live television. Larry Schaefer, a 34-year-old Capitol Police veteran who retired in December 2019, said his former colleagues were experienced in dealing with aggressive crowds. "It's not a spur-of-the-moment demonstration that just popped up," Schaefer said. "We have a planned, known demonstration that has a propensity for violence in the past and threats to carry weapons. Why would you not prepare yourself as we have done in the past?" And there were a number of people who got footage of the protest, including inside the Capitol. The independent media outlet Status Quo had some good footage of the events. And also, there was some interesting documentation of it by, Max Blumenthal of the Gray Zone also was present and recorded a lot of this. But he reports that this fellow who has supposedly been a part of Black Lives Matter showed up with a camera, and turns out that this fellow he was at the front of the Trump mob in the Capitol, egging it on as he recorded the rampage. And the far right is pointing to him as proof of Antifa's role in the riot, because he had been at a number of anti-fascist or Black Lives Matter protests in the past. But leftist activists called him a dangerous provocateur and have banished him. But anyway, the details of this are a topic for another video, but I just wanted to mention that he was right at the front. There he is right there. And you can note that he's a black guy, but he was right at the front of the front lines of these protests, egging people on and encouraging them and taking videos of it. And he actually was the one who got the video footage of let's see if I can find it. I'm not going to show it to you because YouTube might get me in trouble for it. But there's footage in this article actually of the woman who was shot by the police as she tried to climb through a window that other people, including this fellow John Sullivan, who this article's about, broke windows so that they could get through a wall to a place where Congress people, including allegedly Mitch McConnell and perhaps Mike Pence, the police decided to use lethal force if anybody breached that barrier, and they did. She was shot dead instantly, and this fellow John Sullivan got it all on camera, and apparently nobody knows what his deal is, but both activists on the left, such as Black Lives Matter and Antifa activists, and activists on the right, don't want him at their protests, but somehow he keeps showing up. But anyway, what exactly was this? What was it a coup, an insurrection, a riot? Well, let's see what people think. Oh, let me just show you one more tweet here. This person I follow on Twitter says, in the past 30 years I have been to dozens of protests in D.C. I've never been to a protest that didn't have police in riot gear, police on horseback, police blocking side streets, police blocking crowds from getting close to the Capitol/government buildings. This was staged. And I said I went to a protest against the impending Afghanistan war in 2001, and there were probably more cops in riot gear surrounding us for 2 hours at one point than there were protesters, because unfortunately that was a very popular war. And when I went to protest Bush's inauguration in early 2001, again, there was an enormous police presence. There were snipers on every rooftop. There's absolutely no way in any of these cases that I and this other person are referring to that something like this could have happened, where with a little bit of pushiness on the part of the hundreds of protesters who vastly outnumbered the Capitol police force that was guarding the Capitol, they were able to just get right in. Obviously they knew about it, and for whatever reason, they, neither police nor security forces nor intelligence agencies, who obviously all knew that this event was planned, and they did plan for some people to try and invade the Capitol and perhaps stop the certification of Joe Biden as president. Despite knowing all this, for whatever reason, they didn't do what they needed to do to stop it. And I just came across an article today where the former high-ranking person in the Capitol Police, who was forced to resign as a result of this debacle, said that he tried several times to have the National Guard called in, and the sergeants at arms, I guess, in the House and Senate refused to take any action, despite several attempts to contact them. There were people in the military who were contacted, high-ranking people in the military, and they didn't do anything. So, it's not really clear what happened. Certainly it's possible, because we know that there are a lot of people in the police and military who support Trump, sympathize with the right wing, especially in the police. Maybe they supported these protests, and that was why this happened. Or the other possibility is maybe this was something that other forces in the establishment, perhaps on the Democratic side, allowed to happen as a pretext for engaging in ratcheted up repression. Maybe we'll find out. Maybe it was both. I don't know. In any case, one debate that's broken out about these events is Was this a coup, an insurrection, as it's been called by the vast majority of at least Democratic members of Congress and the Democratic wing of the corporate media, or was it something less than that? A riot, perhaps, as this article from PBS referred to it as. So here's what John Pilger had to say about it. John Pilger, the famous Australian journalist who's been a big supporter of Julian Assange, he said, "The made-for-media theatrics on Capitol Hill were not an attempted coup. Coups are what the CIA stages all over the world. Neither was democracy in peril." What democracy? As we've seen, as I've talked about in numerous videos, lots of subversion of democracy in the United States, and not a whole lot of democracy. And Trump, is no more than a caricature of a system of which Biden, Obama, Bush, etc. are the embodiment, he goes on to say. Danny Haiphong of Black Agenda Report said, "So done with this obsession with the, quote, insurrection, shows Americans really live in a bubble. The U.S. orchestrates real coups all the time, which kill tens of thousands of people and destroy entire societies. Clutching pearls about this small riot is as pathetic as it is useless." Richard Medhurst said, "If they care about violence, why didn't they care when Trump was bombing and making threats to bomb the Middle East? Those aren't humans there too? Liberals love imperialism, that's why. They're just as racist and violent as Trump and believe the U.S. should dictate to other peoples." Now, I don't want to minimize what happened. AOC said we came within an inch of half of us losing our lives, or something like that. It's, I think is a gross exaggeration of what happened. But obviously it was not a situation without some danger. There were people killed, some on the rioters' side, and there was also a police officer who was essentially beaten to death by part of this mob. But, as I already discussed, this was easily preventable. There's no reason why security forces couldn't have prevented this mob from getting inside the Capitol in the first place. So, I don't know what you want to call what happened, but Danny and Richard and others make a really good point here, and I've made it as well, that there's this big contrast between what a lot of the media and members of Congress are calling a coup or an insurrection in this case, and what happens instigated by the U.S. in other countries where there was a concerted and well-funded effort to overthrow the government of Venezuela by Donald Trump. Obviously it's been a decade-long effort promoted by the United States and Saudi Arabia and some other countries to try to overthrow the government of Syria. In late 2019, the government of Bolivia was actually overthrown by a military coup backed by the United States. Lots of people were killed. There was essentially a fascist government in Bolivia until very recently, for about a year and a half. This illegitimate military-installed government backed by the United States. And certainly there are many other examples where the violence has been far worse even than these recent examples. And yet, often such events aren't even called coups. as Caitlin Johnson says, we need to stop trivializing the term coup. What happened to the Capitol is just not on the same level as what the U.S. government orchestrates overseas. A coup attempt doesn't have to be successful. You can't take over the U.S. government with a small squadron of wingnuts. She says that's not a thing. A coup attempt doesn't have to be successful for that term to be legitimate, but it does have to have some possibility of success. Trump has no more likelihood of being in office after January 20th than I do. She's Australian, but even if she were American, Trump has no more likelihood than she would of being president. He's got nothing resembling the kind of support from the military, political establishment, oligarchs, and other backing he'd need to accomplish such a thing. And now Trump has conceded. She says, "My, what a funny-looking coup." It's very telling how fast the plutocratic media has been to use the word coup to describe some idiots interrupting Congress for a few hours, since they bend over backwards to avoid using it when their government enacts blatant coups of infinitely greater destructiveness. Here are some of the headlines from when the U.S.-backed coup in Bolivia was taking place. Bolivian President Evo Morales steps down following accusations of election fraud, proclaimed CNN. Bolivia's Morales resigns amid scathing election report, rising protests, reports the Washington Post. Bolivian leader, and so forth. Bolivia's President Morales resigns after backlash to disputed election, says the Sydney Morning Herald. But in reality, Morales was forced from office by the military after winning a legitimate election, which is exactly the thing that a coup is. As I said, there was considerable violence. Lots of people were injured. Hundreds of people were killed. As a result of this coup, and people have been, in hiding from the military. People have been imprisoned simply for expressing any sort of dissent. So it's been a hell of an awful, nightmarish year or so that the coup government was in power there in Bolivia. But, nothing remotely close to that was going to happen in the United States. But the distinction is lost on them, or they just don't want to make it, I guess. And back to what Richard Medhurst said, there's all kinds of acts of violence that Donald Trump has committed overseas that are far worse than whatever this was in the D.C. Capitol the other day, which we don't really know at this point what the connection of Donald Trump is to that, other than the fact that he supported there being protests in front of the Capitol and encouraged people to go there. We don't know if he had any role in what actually happened inside the Capitol. But in any case, let's look at what Trump has done or supported overseas during his 4 years in office. He had a high-ranking and very popular general in the Iranian military, General Soleimani, who played a key role in combating ISIS and other extremist Islamic forces in Syria and elsewhere. He just had him murdered. Obvious violation of international law. Several military strikes have been carried out against Iranians, and obviously the civil war in Syria. The U.S. has continued to be involved in that during Trump's term in office, and as far as I know, the U.S. still has a military force occupying Syrian oil fields and wheat fields. Trump has openly talked about stealing Syria's oil. The U.S. has horrible devastating embargoes against Syria, against Venezuela, against a number of other countries. There were several attempts instigated by the Trump administration to overthrow the government of Venezuela. It's likely that the government behind the scenes supported the coup in Bolivia, and certainly they did openly after it happened. And there are all kinds of other examples of violence that Trump has instigated overseas that are in clear violation of international law and of the U.S. Constitution, since they were undertaken without congressional approval in the vast majority of cases. All of that's impeachable, and no action was taken. Similarly, Trump's financial corruption, where within the first week of office he was using the office of the presidency to make money for his businesses. He could have been impeached for that too. But Congress did nothing. Congress likewise did nothing to George Bush or anybody else in the administration at that time associated with orchestrating the war in Iraq. Colin Powell, with his famous speech to the UN, I believe it was, claiming that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, all the false claims of that, as well as Iraq's government was tied to Al Qaeda, which was nonsense. Then launching this illegal war. Nobody got in trouble for that. Bush wasn't impeached. Pelosi rejected calls for impeachment then, but here Donald Trump has been impeached twice. And I'm not saying that the dude isn't really, horrible, and certainly he deserves to be impeached, but probably not for the things he's been impeached for. We could debate that, I guess, but certainly you could question whether this event that happened at the Capitol was an actual attempt to overthrow the government. Were most of the protesters actually there to try and overturn the results of the election, install Trump back in office? We don't know. But there was no chance of that happening in any case. And we also don't really know what Trump's connection to these events was. So let's see. So, as you know, or probably know, the other thing that happened to Donald Trump was that he got his account permanently suspended on Twitter, and also got suspended from another number of other social media or internet sites. And in their article justifying their banning Donald Trump from Twitter, Twitter said that these two tweets in particular of Trump's violate their glorification of violence policy. So I said, how the hell do they figure that? Because here's what the tweets say. One is, the 75 million great American patriots who voted for me, America first, and make America great again, will have a giant voice long into the future. They will not be disrespected or treated unfairly in any way, shape, or form. And his second tweet was, to all those who have asked, I will not be going to the inauguration on January 20th. So, how do these tweets glorify violence or call for violence, call for people to invade the Capitol, call for insurrection, any of that. They don't. Similarly, I don't really have time to go through it, but if you look at Trump's speech that he gave to the if you look at Trump's speech that he gave to the protesters gathered on the mall there near the Capitol, he didn't mention anything about trying to stop the certification of the election, or going inside the Capitol to try to disrupt that, or anything like that. He did tell people to go protest in front of the Capitol. He also told them to be peaceful. Now that's not to say that Trump wasn't somehow involved in instigating this, whatever you want to call it, riot or insurrection or coup or what have you. But none of the evidence that I've seen so far, either these tweets or his other public statements, in any way, directly calls for this. Now, certainly you could say he didn't do anything to discourage it, and he might very well have had something to do with the failure to have an adequate security presence at the Capitol. That's certainly possible. But as far as I've seen so far, there hasn't been evidence presented that was sufficient. It doesn't seem like to warrant, as the impeachment resolution said, charging him with instigating insurrection. That doesn't seem clear to me. So, now, of course, he has been impeached. What that means is that the House voted, a majority of the House voted to support the impeachment resolution, the charge against Trump of, fomenting insurrection. And so now there will be a trial in the Senate. But what's going to happen there? First of all, it's not even going to start until the day of or shortly after he leaves office. So, part of the justification for this hasty impeachment of Donald Trump by some of the Democratic congresspeople who've talked about it, such as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, was that, and Nancy Pelosi, was that Trump presented a dire threat to U.S. quote-unquote democracy. Well, if it was such a dire threat, for one thing, why did they wait several days after the events of January 6th, the invasion of the Capitol, to meet to impeach him, which they did that one day where they met. It only took a few hours for them to vote to impeach him. And secondly, if it's so urgent, if it's so urgent that he's gonna, threaten to overturn the results of the election, after he has conceded the election, I don't see how that makes any sense. And he's not going to be tried for this charge that was made against him in the impeachment vote by the Senate until on or after he leaves office. So, doesn't change anything as far as when Trump is going to leave office at all. That's still going to be on the same date, January 20th. And if we look at what's got to happen in the Senate in order for him to be convicted, there's got to be a 2/3 majority vote to convict Trump of a charge that he's been charged with in the impeachment resolution. That's a tall order. The Senate, rather, is basically split 50-50 between Democrats and Republicans. Kamala Harris can be the tie-breaking vote if there's a tie. But in order to convict a president or other official who's been impeached, there has to be a 2/3 majority in the Senate. So, okay, maybe all 50 senators are going to vote for impeachment because all of the people who were present in the House who were Democrats voted for the impeachment resolution. So, yeah, maybe all 50 Democratic senators will vote for it. But then you got to get 17 more. Is that going to happen? 17 out of 50 Republicans? It doesn't seem all that likely. We'll see what happens. But, that begs the question. Is this all theater? Is this just another performative gesture by Congress? And not that there's anything necessarily wrong with performative gestures. Certainly many of us were pushing for the Squad and other progressive members of many of us were pressing for the Squad and other members of the progressive wing of the Democrats to force Nancy Pelosi to bring Medicare for All up for a vote in Congress, to bring the Medicare for All bill up for a vote, because the Democrats had such a narrow margin in Congress. So they very easily could have put enormous pressure on her to... Okay, why is my screen frozen? I do not get it. They very easily could have put enormous pressure on her to... I gotta fix this, man. Sorry, I just got to close some windows here because my poor little slow computer is just not handling things very well here. Okay. Well, hopefully that's cleared up now. Anyway. Where was I? It's just not very likely that conviction is going to occur. It won't occur until after Donald Trump leaves office. The House could have pressured Nancy Pelosi to bring up Medicare for All for a vote. She has the power to do that as Speaker of the House, and they could have withheld their votes for her unless she was willing to do that. And they didn't do so. Why did they choose to not do that then? But then, we have to impeach Donald Trump right away. Or not right away, it was a few days, but very quickly they took action in that case, even though they have to know that it's unlikely that he's going to be convicted. Just as they knew, of course, that it was unlikely that Medicare for All would have passed in the House. But does that necessarily mean that they shouldn't have gone forward with that? I've talked about it on the show before. There's certainly historical precedent for forcing a vote on an issue in Congress that through holding up support for a Speaker of the House that you may not have a lot of institutional backing, but has a lot of support from the general public. Medicare for all, just like abolition of slavery way back when, has an awful lot of popular support, and holding a vote for it in Congress could galvanize a movement for it. But anyway, back to the subject I was discussing here. I haven't really seen international reaction so far to... Jesus. Why is it so slow? I haven't seen international reaction so far to the impeachment, but there has been quite a bit of reaction from all over the world to Trump being banned from Twitter. I'm not sure why my computer is being so slow. This is rather ridiculous. But in any case, as Glenn Greenwald points out, Angela Merkel, the longtime Chancellor of Germany, was very critical of Twitter's decision to ban Donald Trump from Twitter. The right to freedom of opinion is of fundamental importance, Stefan Seibert, Merkel's chief spokesman, told reporters in Berlin on Monday. And he goes on to point out, Glenn does, what makes Merkel's comments particularly striking, apart from her well-reported acrimony with Trump, is that Europe generally, and Germany specifically, have far less permissive free speech traditions than the U.S. So Germany has very strict laws. Basically, I mean, if you're like a neo-Nazi in Germany, they won't basically let you broadcast your message on German social media. They'll take it down. They won't let you speak in favor of fascism at a university, for example. They're very restrictive about at least about neo-Nazi or fascist folks having unrestricted freedom of expression, as they essentially have had for a long time here. And yet, Merkel and other German officials found Twitter's decision to just completely wipe Trump out on Twitter quite alarming. As did the president of Mexico, as have elected officials in many parts of the world, because Twitter and Facebook and so forth, social media giants, are kind of like the public square these days. That's where you go if you want to express your opinions to a large number of people. And if you're banned from Twitter or Facebook, that makes it very hard to say what you want to say. And so the question arises, well, what about other people besides Donald Trump? Not necessarily just people on the right, but what sort of precedent is this going to set for freedom of the press in general in the United States? If they go after Trump and other right-wing figures, who else are they going to go after? Well, we already have some indication of what could happen. There was, I forget, Press TV, which is an Iranian independent news outlet, was taken down from Facebook, I believe, the other day. Ron Paul's Facebook page was locked down. You can't post anything on it. There have been a number of incidents of censorship recently that suggests there is a tightening of the screws on freedom of expression here in the United States. So, Twitter back in November, late October or November, I forget, blocked the New York Post Twitter page. You wouldn't let them post anything to it, and took down an article that they had posted, and any efforts to link to that article were not allowed. I tried to do it myself, and I was not allowed to, because it was critical of Joe Biden and Hunter Biden. It was an article about messages on Hunter Biden's laptop that were leaked, that detailed some of the corruption that he was involved in, and we weren't allowed to talk about that. Glenn Greenwald tried to publish an article about what was on Hunter Biden's laptop in The Intercept, the publication that he co-founded a number of years ago, and the editor of The Intercept, Betsy Reed, wouldn't let him do so. And so, he wound up resigning and starting his own blog on Substack, where he publishes his writing now, because basically the outlet that he co-founded, The Intercept, is no longer allowing journalists the freedom to publish what they want to publish, which was the original purpose for which Glenn Greenwald and Lauren Poitras, another co-founder, who's also been fired by The Intercept recently, by the way, that's what they were trying to do, and they were not allowed to. Okay. Well, I've gone on long enough here, so I want to close this out. But anyway, let's stop here. Hope you've enjoyed the video. Like and share and subscribe, and let me know what you think about the impeachment, about Twitter's ban.